a wanted kind of set of associations by the artists, I suppose. And then once you adapt more and more to the light, you realize that there is some sound and some flickering light in two adjacent rooms, and you're kind of like moved in or sucked in or asked by these other spaces to go and look at movies. But at the same time, the movies were also projected in an environment without benches. Here there are benches, kind of. And the environment was completely covered by gray cloth. So what we had was a rather opposite situation than what we have here. Less cold, more enveloping, more kind of like allowing a certain immersiveness. And here, it's words I heard today already earlier: violent, transparent, clean, camp, camp structure. How did that come about? Where does it all come from?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it's tied, yeah, to the development of the installations. I think in many ways this installation is quite linked to my early installations from the early 90s and so on, which were where I picked in a maybe more literal way than this. Systems of control in relation to the body. So there were kind of fences or materials that kind of mapped out little spaces you could move through with your body. So and edges that would, for example, I have to sit like this. Yeah. Edges that were placed in heights that, for example, about 150, which is not literally, but depends on your height. It's not like it necessarily cuts your throat or cuts in your chest, but it approaches you in a height that makes you quite aware of your body and your kind of vulnerability as a subject moving through the space. Then in I guess like the late 90s, through thinking more, leaving kind of these kind of architectural systems of control and so on, I was becoming more and more interested in this. One thing was the kind of specifics of certain spaces within this in the city. That one where maybe particular things to do with the kind of politics of the everyday was played out. For example, parks or nightclubs or sex clubs, or these kind of spaces that had this kind of semi-public function, in one way accessible for many, but you had to fulfill some kind of criteria, either of interest or use and so on, to enter it. And there were also these kind of spaces of kind of momentary fantasy, a kind of, say if you're in a club and for those moments you get in this kind of illusion of exchange of desire and so on. It's very unlike what you can achieve out in your everyday life. And then people leave, the light goes on, and people come to clean or count the money and things like you air it out, and then next day it happens again. So it kind of enters back into the more kind of material economy of the city. So this kind of play on the space that's immersive and allows a different kind of projection of desire than maybe some spaces you occupy other places in the city. But then also this space return as the day goes by into the very kind of economy of the city was something I worked a lot on. And then I did that, and it was, in the beginning they were more literal, like the nighttime parks were really built up like to give an illusion of a nighttime park. There were tons of soil, paths, trees, flowers, plants, a whole living environment that was and kept alive by grow lights that went on when the exhibition was not open. So during the nighttime, the plants got the light, and in the daytime it was shut, so you went into this nighttime fantasy. But at a certain point I felt it was
just one thing about the nighttime, so, and related to the parks. So the night, you consciously wanted the parks to be in nighttime because of the possible alternative uses of the park at night?
Yeah, that was about, yeah, exactly. There was about that moment where it ceased to be a space that is really the kind of desired representation of the city. You know, all the kind of uses that the city wants to show, like the nice social space, a place for kids and so on, to become this space of these other fantasies that, or other uses, depending on what relation, if you use it or not, like if you just think about it or if you actually use spaces. So it becomes a space for sexual cruising, drug trafficking, but also teenage hangout, or people, other people kind of escaping into another space of the city where they can maybe dissolve the narrative of the everyday or and so on. So, and of course, well, that's the more should say the kind of sociological aspect of it. The other aspect is just more phenomenological. It's like to do with the relationship to the subject. You come into a dark space, you can't see so clearly. So it's of course the reason why a nightclub, for example, is dark. It gives a certain kind of freedom for you as a subject. First you come in and you can't see so clearly, and you might feel that this kind of space looks back on you a bit. But this kind of dissolvement of your identity also gives you a kind of freedom, because you become somebody who's not seen clearly in an exchange with other people that are also not seen clearly, and so on. So it's you fill in that kind of emptiness with content. It's maybe a very trivial example, but it's a bit like when you're driving at night in a dark road, and it's really black around you, just have the lights. If you think about what you see, it's very few elements, very few things, and the rest of the space you kind of fill with content from what you know or think you know in a way. So it's that play on the relationship between psychology and space, I guess, that makes it effective. And in an exhibition situation like this, of course, you come then into the space. It's very dark, like you say. At first, you don't necessarily see the environment, and you become very self-conscious because you don't feel you kind of own a privilege point. You kind of, and you have to spend some time before you can understand the environment and you become part of it in relation to somebody that comes in. So that's kind of mechanism, and it related to something I was very interested in, which was exactly this thing about a kind of crisis between personality and space or place.
You coined it through the two words, the dissolvement of identity. And now if we move to this installation, it's not in the dark, it's not pitch dark, it has not this kind of like topical setting. It's more transparent, it's more structural, it's more abstract in a certain sense. What does that do in relation to this idea, which is quite recurrent in your work, this idea of dissolvement of identity? It's really, it's different. And then the in-between step was I kind of merged these things, kept them not so literal. And then I come to this. I mean, it started in some ways trying to just make an exhibition through kind of different axes, kind of optical axis or axis of the gaze, so where you can see or where you can be seen from in a way. And I knew I was going to show two films, and which are themselves quite a lot of content. One is 43 minutes, another is 24 minutes, and so on. And I didn't. Basically, I wanted to kind of carry on something from this idea of the lens and this kind of illusion of space, of looking into something that you work with, of course, in film. And I didn't want to block the space by just making black boxes and so on also. So I'd already made an installation which is maybe kind of hybrid between this and the parks in Italy, which was kind of fenced space. It was open 24 hours, but the whole interior space was covered with plants that gave the kind of darkness I needed and the kind of acoustics I needed, I guess. But here it just seemed less interesting to do that, and I thought, just deal with the kind of function of these fences. In the way these fences are, like just this kind of conventions are really like fences you'd find around a sports ground or something like this to catch high balls. But of course, within a space like this, it's more about kind of restriction of movement and so on. And a kind of certainly in the entrance room, it has less to do with this typical urban sports environments where it's indeed there to keep the ball inside and when kids are playing. But in the entrance room, it has a reminiscence of the structure of a camp. and a control mechanism. So it was, you enter the show with this kind of idea, oh, it's about this, maybe not about, but it evokes this control structures.
Yeah, certainly it's control structure in relation to the body, and the one that always allows you to see the thing that you can't have or can't get to. So it's not hidden from. It's not like a kind of brick wall or something. But it's just that your vision is allowed, but not your physicality. So you're controlled. And in the first space, I did something similar to what you said in Kunsthall. It's a space you come in and there's no film there. It's just a bit of kind of a pause between the films. But in many ways, it's of course very kind of it's a quite violent space in all those layers of fences. But it's also again a kind of optical space. The only thing there is like apart from the fences are the kind of projections of shadows and those two spots that are used to kind of illuminate sets or so on. So,
do you think the fact that you can look at the other side of the fence and look through the fence, this control structure that you're allowed to see, that where you're not able to go, that it adds to the violence of it?
Sure, that's the kind of if there's violence in fence, that's exactly what it is, that you know what you can't have. So that plays even more strongly on desire in a way, because it's not just a kind of empty category. You really know what's on the other side. Yeah. And at the same time, it's something that almost it's a bit like looking at a reflective building. It's as if something is looking back at you, because like being in a relationship to a fence, you are you also become kind of subjected to that. You become somebody who is measured in relationship to it. So yeah.
What is really interesting, and I hope for the people that have seen the show already, is the installation of this film, Abyss. In fact, your first encounter with Abyss is when you enter the room and you see it, in fact, in mirrored version through the fence.
Yeah.
And it allows even for the public to realize it only at a later stage that the so-called more authentic or more real projection is happening on this side. And for me, we were talking about it this morning. It reminded me a lot about, and it's not just an anecdote because we can elaborate on that, about a structure which is very common in Indonesian shadow play. The relation of the simulacrum and the real, which is played out in a very complex way, in a certain mise en abîme. We all think that when we attend a shadow play in Indonesia that we are looking only or allowed to look only at the side of the shadows, the projected, behind the projection that you only see. But then the weird thing is the puppets are wonderfully decorated. They are made out of skin. And people would wonder, why is that? And the whole interesting part is that you realize after a while, it's also interesting in relation to your 24 hours open installation at Manifesta. It's a hour-long ongoing performance, and you're allowed to walk around, so you're also allowed to see the puppet master, which is kind of in our cultures an impossibility. And it relates to this whole idea of also light and dark, that in our culture, long time, dark was not allowed, or was kind of like a negative environment. That light was the thing that made things clear, that rationalized environment, etc. And that in Asian culture, and I refer to Gunaran, and the last name I can't pronounce, it's an Indonesian author that based a research on space on Henri Lefebvre's texts, and he brought forward a kind of new assessment of the not totally dark, but the in-between space between light and dark, the space of the shadow and all the possibilities there. And you refer to the shadow play in that context to kind of like reevaluate this indeterminate space between light and shadow. And I associate it a lot with many of your installations, that we never are in a limpid light. It's also never a transparent shedding of light on actions within the films. Even if they happen during the day, there is a kind of darkness about them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example. What I like about this is this: you have to find out that you can see those puppets kind of by yourself through like watching the film, and then suddenly getting curious that you can move around. And it's something. I mean, yeah, I just think it's something that is relating a lot to in other ways to things I'm thinking about in relation to film. Basically, it's between making something apparent as constructed and revealing the construction of it and the language, but also then getting the freedom from that. Like if you make films that are only a kind of illusion of a kind of real narrative, you lose a lot of possibilities from more how you can push language and viewer listener relationships in through making things that are more constructed sometimes, or move between. Which we're much more used to that in literature. For example, we're always used to books that one page is like very realistic, next page just becomes like an hallucination, and then you're back again, and we have no problems to make those shifts. And of course there are a lot of different kind of films, but within film we are more kind of tuned to this kind of to that film structures, more naturalistic illusion or something like this. And so in this shadow play, then you come in and you see the piece, and then you discover that also there's details, and it just adds another element to it. It kind of makes the piece grow in a way. But even in that moment, you reveal the structure. It doesn't limit it to just become what should I say, just a material piece or something like that. And
that means it's a term that's very often associated with your work, with your installation, but which happens in fact also then within the film, is the notion of heterotopia, in contradiction to utopia, that you say the normal narrative movie is following the ideology of its medium, and that in your films, and then we can come to another aspect, the films are a heterotopia of cinema within the film already. They are kind of disruptive within its own medium, like when we come to the characters, and it's maybe also how we are choreographed through the exhibitions, that we have to see at something, then discover something, react different, because we realize that we can come on the backside in this case. Also your characters, which are in one or another way non-characters, they switch from, let's say, believable narration into self-reflection, obstructive language. There is an enormous differentiation in how they fulfill or not fulfill their roles. So they are not kind of like real subjects with an interiority. They are kind of like completely outside. They are kind of performing all these possibilities. They, at certain moment, in certain films, directly address the viewer outside of the screen, which is a no-go in classical narrative cinema, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. I do work with the kind of conventions of film. Of course, that has been worked on by a lot of other people, but it's partly this thing we talked about, like to open up for more possibilities for me to work, but also to be more active in relation to the viewer relation. So you get this. It's a bit. I guess it's maybe a kind of an idea that comes a lot from installation. This idea of like if you make an immersive environment or not, and to work with these things, because everything implies a certain kind of power balance, of course. So if it's just immersive, you just kind of thread the context is just kind of put over your head in a way, and but at the same time to only keep the viewer in a distance is another kind of violence and so on. And to be able to move between, you have possibility to get different relations to the piece as a viewer as it moves, and you also have different amounts of pleasure in relation to the work. And and I forgot what I was going to say.
Maybe we can elaborate on that. It seems as if and also for us as the viewers, we are mirrored, or we mirror the things that happen in the film. It seems as if there is a refusal that subjects define the world, the outside. There is a very interesting overcoming of this subject-object contradiction, or how do you say this contradiction between subject and object, which is classical modern thought, is constantly overcome or disrupted in the films, and also, in fact, in the relation to the viewer. And it's a very interesting thing to see that also sometimes in the dialogues there is, in an almost humoristical way, it hints at that, like, for example, in the opening scene of Abyss, when the two characters talk in the car, that when one asks if she is beautiful, the other retorts with saying, like, well, the mirror will answer your question there. So that's the whole idea. I can't look at you, I'm not relating to you, but the supposedly objective world will be subjective enough to give you that answer, or kind of like influence also your behavior. And it's something recurrent, I think. Of course, it relates to what you researched earlier or worked with earlier, the whole notion of mimicry, camouflage, psychasthenia. So there is this whole idea of the object world, or the so-called non-person's world, that influences us as much as we, that kind of objective part of the deal.
Yeah. I tried to construct this film quite a lot in that respect. So you have the mirror thing, and of course her comment is but in the mirror you see everything the wrong way around, like, you know. And so,
but that comes then back in the installation here.
So it comes back to the installation, but also through the film, it's like this movement between the role of the material, like just kind of objects, goods, things you buy, and so on, and that kind of economy, to move where the kind of grip on the material lessens, and it becomes more a kind of a psychological dimension, and back again. So it's different sets of the kind of projecting meaning into people that each one of them are limited, of course. And you could say, of course, in the kind of material world, and the kind of background in the film is, like, you know, way beyond the control of the characters in the film. That's of course true, but then the different kind of approaches to conversation through the film is also like different attempts at constructing or bringing meaning into language for the subject. So it's not just that the subject is totally displaced and those characters can't, or if there is a character, it can't have any meaningful relation to the world, but that relation can take on many forms.
But it's more like the whole setting, the characters and the objects and the outside, they are not exactly sharing the same space, but they're performing the aim of sharing the same space.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they move towards the possibility of sharing the same space.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing, of course, with if you mentioned utopia, heterotopia. Utopia is a non-existent world, of course. The heterotopia, the thing with heterotopia is the kind of a key example is you say the utopia is this image you see inside the mirror, while the heterotopia is that mirror that kind of facilitates that reflection, that reminds you that you're standing there in the space. So it's a relationship to something material in your world that tells you about your place. I said it's a lot of other things about heterotopia as a particular space, and so I'm not going to go into that. But I was just thinking it's about being defined, or your world being defined through relationship to a material world, and through what you do, like your use of that space also, which is very different than a utopia, of course.
But it still remains the feeling that there is the whole idea of like moving towards self-definement of the characters, becoming subjectivities, but they never really become subjects or with a real interior. It all kind of like is a permanent reflection to the outside. It's as if they don't find their evident understanding. It's as if they are. It's not. You said it's not about alienation, which I think I grasp, but it's still they are refuse to become representations. Or they refuse to become, no, they don't refuse, they are refused to become representations, they are constantly searching this thing. So that brings us back to this very old notion that is often used in relation to your work, this Roger Le Calois idea of psychasthenia coming out of early surrealism. This idea that in the films it's always mimicry and never a real representation. That is always kind of staying in this camouflage idea.
Yeah, I'm very. I guess that's been quite important for me. This whole idea of psychasthenia. What it is really is about a kind of disruption or problem in the relationship between personality and space. That doesn't mean that or it's, you can only have a position of being alienated or kind of dissolved as a subject. Because this thing about this crisis in relation to personality and space is where you kind of lose the sense of being kind of one thing is like the agent of your own position and so on, or being the carrier of your subjectivity. You feel like your subjectivity is really defined by the space and situation, or the the place, the society, or whatever, rather than by yourself. So it's like he brought up this idea of camouflage in insects and so on, and showed that it was not about creating a kind of benefit for the animal that was being camouflaged and was becoming one in the space. It was really about being seduced by the space and becoming part of a subjectivity that was defined by that space in a way. Or it can be said in different ways. But what's interesting for me, I think, is a kind of dynamic of this, that you are quite often not able to define your, or to be the agent of defining your subjectivity or your place, but it's not a static thing, and it's not just because you can consciously pull yourself out of it or something like this. It's because society is disrupted. So you might be pulled into one kind of atmosphere, one society, and so on, and become absorbed by kind of environment. But it's often temporary. There's something else that's going to disrupt and maybe pull you in another direction, and even maybe then your own kind of agency, your own kind of active relationship can also maybe define another space and so on. So subjectivity isn't just placed in one place. You're not just like the acting person in relation to society. You're also not only totally absorbed into a thing where you lost all possibility of interference and so on. But it's usually a kind of process of being pulled between different power relations, different things. So one easy example was earlier, maybe just like the mechanisms of the clubs and things like this. But it could also be, it kind of meets you in everyday life in different ways, whether you shift from one environment to another, or just handling everyday problems like getting money, getting food, and so on, where your possibility of being independent or in control kind of shifts through the day.
Still, the characters, the protagonists, or the bodies, or I don't know how exactly to call the figures or the persons in the different movies. It seems that they are errant from one movie to another, because some kind of come back. If you follow your work, there is and there's also always 4 or 5, and they're kind of isolated of other people, the figurants or the other people in the environment, in the urban environment, or the train in Oblique, or they are like as if they are pushed into the image existence. Far away and beautiful, like one of the other characters say, the picture. And they are rarely relating or interrelating to what happens with your main characters. It seems as if they're really like, I associated it with the zombie, the idea, this hypothetical being, the non-dead, that is errant, on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
And the only thing they produce are short circuits, even on markets, even in economies. They exchange pullovers with no reason. They steal newspapers, which is an absurd act. They discuss about the position of shoes on the market stand, which, and then they say also whatever.
Yeah.
But there is this kind of like permanent short circuit thing in their economies, and the real subjective narrations are hearsay. Then they talk about the story with the prostitute, they talk about like the more dramatic things that are referred to in the films are always hearsay. And they are like as if they never touch ground, or are I also called it in the text this idea of authentic forgeries of subject.
Yeah, I was going to say, except in Finally,
Yeah.
but not really, because that's kind of authentic forgery. In Finally is a film, then there's like repeated fights, so it's very physical, and it kind of happens repeatedly through the film, but it's not really motivated by the kind of story or the interaction between them. But yeah, it became almost a joke in Abyss, because and I understood this thing with the Okwe, who's the main character in Abyss. For those of you who have seen it, it's a tall black woman who is kind of basically the main kind of narrative carrier through the film, but she doesn't say necessarily as much as the others. So we were joking about she becoming like a kind of Klaus Kinski character, or well, he speaks a lot, but just like this kind of positioning, or kind of Clint Eastwood character was becoming a kind of Western construction just by moving through and being exposed to all this, being exposed to dialogue from other people more so than kind of developing it herself. But it's true, I've worked a lot, it's different things coming in. There's one thing is I worked with several actors for a long time. With Okwe, I've worked with her for 15 years, really. And so it's become a way of me to think about making the film through thinking about some of these characters, some of the actors that I know can supply certain things to the film. But it's also been a shift. Like in the earlier films, I was so occupied with kind of breaking down any kind of acting conventions. So I was really just kind of placing the actors more as objects, and then they had certain lines that had to be said, and they were so scripted. Like every comma had to be said in a certain way, and all the rhythm and all stuff had to be kind of rehearsed very much. And but getting to know different actors also, I guess, through the time and working for longer with cinema, become more and more interested in actually what the actors can supply, and rather using actors that have very different methods. Like, for example, Okwe, I'm going aside from your question now, so I can come back to
Doesn't matter.
but Okwe, who's really, she writes plays and acts, and she's very into kind of critical theater, new theater. She's doing a lot of really great performances based in New York and so on. She's also in some Hollywood films and things like this, but it's really to finance her theater productions and so on. And but it's a kind of acting that's very occupied with the kind of whole build-up of the character, the kind of just kind of critical attention to how you move your arm or things like this. And then you have Ben, which is like all the way on the other side, and he's much more, kind of method actor. He has to have described a kind of subjectivity. What he does then, he becomes very creative around it, and he kind of constructs a kind of mini narrative within the film. With those two actors, I can put them together in a scene, and what happens then is that even if they talk and have a dialogue, they occupy totally different space. Like Ben will look like he really belongs to that material space. He's very grounded, and Okwe just kind of floats through the scene. So she becomes that kind of zombie in that scene, and so on. But I can use that element, or have that part where there is actually exchange of words. There is a dialogue. There is something that's being kind of developed, but it's clear also that they occupy really different worlds.
Yeah, it's very. Then, but to come back to the last part of the question, is like the other people, the non-actors. They have no presence almost. It's very interesting that in most of your films we have an urban setting and it's very empty of people. There are only those people. It's as if it's after something that happened to the world or something, this is the only 5 left, or this kind of situation.
Well, I would say in Abyss there's quite a lot of the people in markets and things like this, and they also interrupt.
But they stare back at us like, I don't know.
Yeah. There's 2 things. One thing is, like, for example, in the market where Ben and Oak, we have the dialogue, they're walking through and she puts the shoe that way and on the sun. Then there's a lot of interference to this. People climbing, a lot of people come almost walking into the camera, looks and moves away. And of course, in one way, it can be this kind of very kind of structural cinema thing or critical cinema thing where you are kind of revealing that you're shooting something. But it's actually on a different level. It just created a dynamic where 2 people are walking around, and in the market you might be trying to pass somebody and you find another way around. So we just get away with it in a way, and it creates a kind of a quite useful structure around the action. The other scene that you refer to is in the market with the camera basically just moves through the whole market, and you have constantly people looking at into the camera and commenting on it. One boy also says, I think it's almost not audible, but he says, "There's a camera," or something. But I think the main thing of that scene is not really about. It's not so much. I mean, it has that aspect too. It's you kind of. You can understand the dynamic, you understand that these people looking in the camera, but another way it becomes, the camera gets a lot of subjectivity to that space in a very kind of classical cinematic way. So it's almost as if like Oku is walking through the market, and people look back. Some people hold the gaze longer, others not. And at the same time, it gave us a chance to really describe this place, this kind of...
To come to that, to this place, this is... it's a very specific place in London, which you don't want to specify in the film too much, but it is a place of a certain contestation, like most of the places, also in a metaphorical sense, you evoke in your films are spaces of contestation. This is a place in London with a lot of migration, immigrant groups living next to each other. Then the other film is filmed in Lebanon, has remnants of war in the setting, relates to the way how certain criminal acts happen there. So there's a lot of contestation potential in these spaces. And I wanted to relate to what we were talking earlier about how you relate to the political. We were talking about the difference with documentary, the difference with cinéma vérité, the difference with this kind of sometimes sad fashion in contemporary art, that there is only a political stance evoked that we anyway agree with as art lovers. And how do you relate to the idea of the political, or how do you want to be political?
Yeah, I've always been quite occupied with the kind of political potential of art, but it's really important for me that it's not just a way to return like the audience's political opinion back to them in poetic form, just like something that's clearly identifiable and already agreed upon and given back, but rather that in the work set up certain relations so that the work can become a process itself of you relating to different things, and also mentioning maybe political content in different ways. Part in the film, it can be a bit serious, something can be slapstick, something can be pathetic, and so on. But it's all like different modes of delivering content, and doesn't take away, I think, the possibility of mentioning a context and mentioning things to do with the everyday struggle or historical struggle and so on. So I'm quite interested in that, not privileging different ways of language really, or enunciations in the film, or privileging, for example, or putting side by side, even in the same space, the same sentence, even like something humorous, something serious, something pathetic at the same time. But more clearly to your question, I think I like to set up certain relations so that the work, also film, becomes more a kind of experience that you have to relate to in relation to what's at play. It's not that it's already formed statement for you, but it's like certain issues are at play, and in the work you are exposed to those things. And that could take us back to the idea of an installation, really. It's like moving through a space and relating to different things in the place that you have to digest through that experience.
Maybe then, if more specific, when I was talking political, is like more topical.
Yeah.
And I think something that is not often or not very often mentioned or being written about or being told is the constant economy in your films, is the constant exchange. There is always exchange of something, sometimes real buying stuff. Also, here in this film it becomes very apparent. They go to Western Union. There is this I think it's finally they exchange jumpers for no reason. There is a constant like, and in Bliss it becomes a very weird sexualized exchange of with something during a kiss. That's apparently very important. It comes back and back and back. This whole idea of being maybe the only thing we're all extremely subjected to is this exchange of things, goods, thoughts, language, speech, and that it's a kind of an, when you say it in terms a la Guattari, it's a kind of slavery or enslavement to this this practice.
Well, yeah, exchange is very central idea to my work, and it's very, like you said, very apparent in Abyss. So, and it's on different levels. Of course, you have like an economies of desire and so on. It's not that I just think of like exchange in terms of like material goods and so on, but it's just like different kind of maybe like critical horizons for people. So it's like if it's to do with the desire, that kind of economy, what kind of place you have it in it, how you exchange. Also conversations and so on, exchange or attempts at exchanging or stoppages of exchange of meaning or content and so on. But of course, there's also in my films quite often a reference to a real kind of material and monetary economy, which I think is really part of a lot of people's everyday struggle. Struggle is a kind of horizon, a kind of traumatic horizon in lots of people's lives, and how you kind of can or in relationship to how you can define or experience yourself as well, let's put it another way. Basically, I think it affects the way you experience yourself as a subject, clearly, and your relationship to a kind of struggle or non-struggle on a kind of economic level also gives you a place or not a place in relation to the environment. So it's also connected to this idea of the relationship between personality and space and so on, relationship to meaning or dissolvement of meaning,
In the photographs in this show, the photographs that are preluding another movie project of yours, the photographs that have been taken in Oslo, this kind of relation to environment becomes extremely liquid or almost synthetic. The characters or the bodies, they dissolve into the architectural, natural environment completely. It's quite interesting how finally in a series of still images, this syntheticism between ourselves as bodies, as mirroring the environment, becomes very, very, how do you say it, it succeeds in this still image to bring that idea completely.
Thank you. And also, I attempted to do that. There are photos from kind of threshold areas, a kind of area where kind of urbanity kind of breaks down a bit, or it's kind of edge where it kind of stops, or also maybe kind of between urbanity, suburban, or just kind of growth and nature, things like this. It's kind of, it's a kind of fringe of a structure. But I also try to relate the subject to the people in the photos in the manner you talk about, where sometimes just through that if they are close to the lens, either they move or the camera moves, so everything behind is close and they're kind of more merged with the space, or like working with a shadow, just the disappearance of the kind of token of subjectivity, like a face or something into a shadow. So it's really a kind of it's kind of threshold or crisis between environment and subjectivity in a pictorial sense. Yeah. So yeah.
In that sense, to finalize this, but maybe then open it up to the public. I was thinking about some painterly ideas, and certainly also you mentioned it in relation to the photographs, that in a painting it allows, that's a very weird thing, it allows like reality to look both left and right and everywhere. You're not bound to one perspective. It's quite interesting that happens on all levels also in your films, that you, in that sense, it might relate even to painting. You are allowed to look in all kind of directions, which is not possible in a normal photograph or in a normal, let's say, perspective depiction of reality. This rationalized depiction of reality, which was always contested by painting in a certain sense. That's really, really nice how you bring that back, but then via a medium that was not kind of like told to do that in
That's
in the art
interesting,
space.
because we talked a bit about painting before, and I started as a painter and so on, so I think a lot of the way I set up things, and also the kind of way of thinking about the conventions and how something is built up, I think has a lot to do with the background in painting. It's like if you started painting, is like, you know, it's a kind of medium that really asks you to be critical to how it's built up and so on. But what he's saying now relates to something I didn't think about in relation to painting, but I just thought in relation to photography and film. And what's something that always fascinated me about it is, like, to the degree which is so different from how we look at things, how in real life. Like if I look at you now, I see you. This is kind of blurry. But I'm looking at you as I'm talking, and maybe I'm thinking about something else, and I move, you move. So it's always this kind of disruptions. Of course, if you have a photograph or a painting, and to some degree it's like a film, it's like within a given frame, you can give equal attention to like everything. So it's like you're looking kind of all over with the same kind of clarity or not, and so on. So it's just really this strong difference from how you perceive and experience things just by act of looking normally, is for me what gives it the kind of I don't know, interesting potential, or something that is a total basic structure. So it's like, instead of thinking of photography or film as something that really is just kind of recording real life, it's exactly how it allows you to look at things in such a different way that becomes a kind of, I don't know, interesting basis for how you can work with it.
So before we start to enjoy ourselves too much, I would like to.
Anything.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Will you share this afterwards?
If you can share this one.
Okay.
It would be nice if everyone can use a microphone when asking questions, also for the recording.
I was trying to remember to get it right first, because I tend to get confused between Samuel Beckett and Bertolt Brecht. But there's this play I just saw reenacted last year in the Mercosul Biennial that took place in the south of Brazil, called Breath. Does anyone know who's I'm not sure if it's Beckett or Bertolt Brecht. Anyway, this radical play is 30-second long, and it's the way it was reenacted, at least, it was behind a fence, and you had to light projectors. And then the play starts with this scream that is supposed to be the most horrific sound ever pronounced amongst us, which is the moment when the baby gets born, the very moment. And then in between the projectors, there's garbage. And the light accompanies the breath. So there's the scream, then this breathing, and then the scream again. 30 seconds later, the play is gone. And when I came in the first time, when I saw the exhibition at the opening, Of course, many things came to mind, and this play kept coming to my mind as I walked around the space and listening to you guys talk right now. What really, I can say that especially when I saw Abyss, the part when the girl collapses and the guy says, and the natural move would be to help someone to get back on their feet. But then he just announces to her that what really is collapsing is her way of perceiving things, of being comfortable with her identity in that space. Having said that, I saw that through that side, so behind the fence. And then I thought that actually the rigidity with which we have to move around the room because of the fences, and like I couldn't just walk straight to get here. I had to do all this. It shows like how normal it's become for us to realize that the core of the capitalist economy is free will, democracy, freedom, but it's actually these concepts are framed by very rigid rules of movement, of mobility in the city, and how I think is emulated here. But then some of the film, some of the frames are so like big and ample, I guess you can say that. Like when you sometimes just hear voices and you have you see this massive construction sites. Or in the other film, like there's this almost like intimate dialogue with this massive landscape behind, and how we get lost and abandoned. So I guess the relation would be the scream. I felt when I saw the girl collapsing, I was very touched. And then it relates to the scream in the sense that that scream is the most natural, but at the same time the most horrific act. And then the notion of horror is already a cultural construct. So it's almost like it's a very claustrophobic experience we have, because it's almost like we really can't separate anymore what's organic. I just saw the green here. And what is constructed, and we're sort of caught in between. That's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, the idea of horror is like you say, it's really a cultural construct. It's this thing that threatens language or threatens meaning in a way. So it's and in a moment of collapse or something like that, you would say the kind of horror can announce itself because it's for a moment you don't understand or something like that. And, yeah. Of course, his response, like you say, is a very kind of it's the opposite of what you would do, and it's a kind of it's a very sadistic response. Also, it's just kind of describing her collapse then, and her like collapse in relationship to an idea that would be meaningful, like or construct her as a strong subject. So it's a physical but also psychological collapse. I don't know, that wasn't really a good response, but yeah.
Is it? Yeah. In more commercial films, I think the figures are the main characters or have the main roles. But in your films, I think it's almost the opposite. That the figures are just helping us to get focused to the environments. Is that one way to see it, or is a balance between? For me, when I saw the films, it was almost like they were just giving space to the space in one way. Can you say something about that?
Well, I guess that happens in some of the films, some of the scenes for sure. That they are the characters and their dialogue describe a situation which is also about the place and about the time and so on, more than about their own psychology. But even though in some scenes it's maybe also about the kind of relations of power between the different characters. So I think, well, I'm trying at least to not make it just one thing, but certainly the dialogues and the relationship it does put the place into context as much as they are being put into context by the place also. Pardon?
For me, it's interesting to see that you give space to the room in between the figures and the space for the environments. So it gives me it's more tense and more interesting to me to watch.
Yeah. I guess it's the freedom for when you work. Sorry, it's a kind of freedom, whatever that you get when working in kind of context of film that's being shown in art venues and film festivals and so on. Because like if you look at, there's a lot of commercial cinema that in parts really do fantastic things about this. But the overall structure of the film, because of funding and all these things, and because of the role of the producers, the overall piece has to be put into a kind of narrative that makes sense in a more kind of classical model. But you can see elements of this in commercial films that maybe push these things even further than a lot of art films. It's just that because of the kind of strictures on that format, they're not allowed to work on that throughout the film.
Thanks for a great talk. I just wondered about the places. How do you choose them? And are there any like common characteristics that triggers your interest? Like, how do you come to choose like Tripoli and Groruddalen, which is in one way really different places? Is there anything common, or what triggers the locations?
Yeah, I guess there's certainly something common, and many of the films have been in cities. It's a kind of environment I can relate to. I live in small cities and big cities, whatever, but I always live in kind of urban environments. I think it's just, in one level, it's just a way I can imagine putting together different elements within the frame. But it's also just this thing, like for example, with Abyss, I wanted to be able to capture within the frame elements that had to do with change over time and migration over time. So I wanted to have a kind of representation of things that weren't just about today. So in London you can get an old building and another old building that is about another time, and another kind of group of people moving through that part of the city, and you can have a new one next to it, and or one from the 90s, one from the 2000s, and so on. You have something collapsing and something being built up and so on. Just within one frame you can mention so many different kind of parts of history and different kind of economics. And also in terms of having an environment where you can see these kind of different levels of change just in people and so on. So it was very useful. I tried, and because this production was initiated by an English production company, and I tried to move out of the idea of London, because I thought, okay, I don't want to do London. It's very token. Everyone's just going to see London written over the screen when I make this film. So I tried to travel around and to find other environments, and it's of course in reality there are many cities in England that are very composite and so on. But just photographically within the frame, it was really hard to get the same thing playing out, because the areas of the city would be much more homogeneous. Like in one area the houses really look one way, another area they look one way, and so on. Of course the composition of people in them might be all kind of different, but for the kind of purposes of my film I kind of returned to East London because it was more effective for all that stuff I wanted to cram into the lens. And with Lebanon it was a very different situation. Of course it's like within the frame of things I'm interested in, but I saw some photographs of this Niemeyer complex like 3 years ago, and immediately thought I wanted to make a film based on that, understanding the kind of context of that. And then I was going to shoot it 2 years ago, and it wasn't possible because there was another eruption of conflict and so on, and got it. But that was more, so that was accidental, really, that I found that place, but it fitted the kind of context of my work. With the Groruddalen, I was invited to do a project there, a kind of documentary project. And first I said no, because I didn't know how I could handle a documentary format. And I'm also trying to do something different in documentary. I like, of course, a lot of documentary films and so on. But I feel within the kind of art context has become a kind of there's become in the kind of more lazy part of the critical apparatus has become almost a kind of documentary and collage films are the only way to present kind of political film or film works. Of course, not everyone thinks so, but it's been. But I thought, okay, it's as much as I liked. I thought that I should try to work with documentary material in another way. So, in the end, I said yes, I can do it, but I'm not going to use a reportage look camera. I'm not going to have on-screen interviews, but I'm going to construct it from documentary material from the place, like stories assembled from people, kind of different cases I could read about and so on, and lots of images. So it's a project that really just started, and in this start we started in the beginning of that we started to assemble material. We started to shoot things in Grorud, and then I started to look at the pictures. So the pictures you see here are of course not a documentary set of photographs of Grorud. They don't tell you kind of a real description of Grorud. They could have been from many different places, but it's. But I guess it relates to my other work in terms of kind of interest in kind of threshold areas where a kind of structure is kind of edge of a structure, or where the kind of structure is breaking down and so on. And yeah. So it's you know, in some way these were very different ways of finding these places, but of course it's, you know, I'm only able to get ideas for things I'm interested in. So it connects through my attention to the kind of composite environment. I guess that's kind of and a composite environment I feel that I can understand on some level. So I guess that's why mostly, you know, I'm mostly made projects in areas that I have some kind of that I know something about and have some kind of understanding of the history of something. Yeah.
We're going to put on the film, right? Abyss. Before we do that, I want to remind you all that we're going to have guided tour here tomorrow in the exhibition at 1 and 3, 2 guided tours actually. And then in August again, we're going to have a new platform that is going to have point of departure in this exhibition, and it is related to the publishing of the catalog, or the book, I must say. It's a very ambitious project that we're coming up with now with in related to Knut Åsdam's work. We have text by Kaja Silverman, Philippe Pirotte, Simon Scheik. And Simon Scheik will come here the 19th of August. So you're all welcome back then. I think that was it of information. Did I forget anything? No, good. Thank you all for coming, and especially thanks to Philippe and Knut. And enjoy Abyss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.